Meet the World War II experts who work on the battlefield. This is the Bunker Boys Show with your host, Tony Cisneros.
Welcome back, everyone. This is episode 2 of the Bunker Boys Show. If you're even remotely into World War II, this is the show for you. Today we'll be talking to Paul Woodage in Normandy. We'll be discussing what took place in a little village there called Angerville-la-Plain. It's where two medics from the 101st Airborne Division on D-Day, June 6, 1944, they set up an aid station inside that church, and they ended up caring for over 80 people from both sides, including Americans, Germans, and even a small French girl who was hit by shrapnel during the fighting in that town. Here at the Bunker Boys Show, our mission is to bring World War II to the world, and we're doing that one little piece at a time. You see, history is like a big puzzle. We'll never actually have all the pieces, but the more pieces you can find that fit together, slowly but surely, a picture begins to emerge. In studying World War II, I found that war brings out the worst and also the best in people. We often hear about the atrocities and the violence of war, but what about the lesser-known acts of compassion? I think that they're just as equally, if not more important to share, because they offer us balance, and they bring us back to the human side of warfare. So let's meet Paul Woodage. Paul is going to share a story of compassion with us. Paul is a writer, a filmmaker, a consultant, a lecturer, a tour guide, and he's also executive producer of this show. Let's bring him on. Hey, Paul. Welcome to the show. It's so great to have you on. I've really been looking forward to this conversation with you. How are you doing over there in Normandy?
I'm very well, thank you. It's a lovely sunny day. I'm happy to be involved and happy to talk to you. Just raring to go.
Fantastic. So we told our viewers a little bit about your background, but can you tell us more about your personal connection with World War II and how you ended up in Normandy, France?
Sure. Well, like anyone else who's my age group, World War II was just part of my childhood. It was the 1970s in Britain, and we watched war movies on a Saturday afternoon. We read comics set at Alamein and the Battle of Britain, and it was just part of our culture back then. But in my family, my great uncle was a platoon commander in the 2nd Battalion Royal Ulster Rifles on Sword Beach on D-Day. He's the chap on the right there on the pile of rubble. That's in the middle of Caen. And that was taken on July the 9th, 1944. That's been on the cover of numerous books, that photo. And and that helmet that he's wearing is in my little war room. So that's my personal connection. And he grew up in a household in London with a wife, a female lodger, and 2 daughters. And I saw him 2 or 3 times a year. And because I was the only kind of guy in his life who had a vague interest in World War II, he would tell his stories to me because he had a habit of telling them at home, and everyone would go, shh. But I didn't go, shh. I would say, tell me more. And so he told his stories to me. And there was my grandfather as well. It was in the Royal Artillery, and my grandmother was in the Royal Voluntary Service, and you know, all my family served. And so my connection with Normandy is through that. And also, I got a copy of Overlord by Max Hastings when I was about 11 years old from my aunt who worked in a library, and it was an ex-library book. And she might have got me a book about the Battle of Britain or the Burma or something, but it happened to be a book about D-Day and Normandy, and that was the first, if you like, adult book that I read beyond comics, and that's what steered me down the Normandy path as opposed to Arnhem or something else. So that's the 2 reasons: family connection and just the right book at the right age.
You have an amazing story about some individuals in the area of Utah Beach. We'd love to hear more about that story, what happened in Angerville-la-Plain, because you've written a book about this.
I have, yeah. Well, it's quite a simple story. I don't actually know quite where it began. I mean, as you said, I've been running tours here for nearly 2 decades, and I had a few guides work for me. And we would do, you know, the standard loop of, you know, Santa Maria Iglesia in the morning, Utah Beach, Pointe du Hoc, Omaha, American Cemetery. And really, it was a case of trying to find something to fit in after Utah Beach before you drove to Pointe du Hoc. And, we started going there. This is a little 5-minute, barely a 5-minute stop. Just stop and say, oh, there was this church here, and explain in very small details what happened. And it was a nice little human interest. And I'll explain more in a minute about what the story was, that would come in between the large scale of Utah Beach and the rather dramatic events at Pointe du Hoc, both of which are very important, but quite big events. And the story of Angerville-la-Plain was a little small story that brought it down to the events inside a small church that people actually started to relate to very quickly, particularly those that perhaps didn't have a big interest in the war. They perhaps were the ones who were struggling to understand regiments and battalions and companies and things. But then you take them to a church where a little story happened, and you can visualize it. And it ended up becoming a stop that when I do it now on tours, I'm there for an hour. So it was 5 minutes originally, and now it's an hour, and I could probably do a whole day there if asked. And broadly speaking, the story is about two medics in 2nd Battalion, 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, who were to land on Drop Zone D, which I think is interesting because that unit didn't have a clear objective in the way some other paratroopers did, that are there to seize bridges and causeways and crossroads. The Americans taking this area of Angerville-la-Plain were there to eliminate a German force who were there, and the Germans were there to eliminate the Allied force, and it just became an arena of combat without really there being an objective in the middle of it. I mean, there are a few roads that meet in this village, but not enough to be a significant junction. It just happens to be a place where combat took place. And the casualties just soared there because it was a decent German enemy there. A lot of the Germans up behind some of the beaches are your typical kind of stereotypical old men, young kids, and not very well trained. But some of the Germans in Angerville were Fallschirmjäger, so German paratroops who were, a bit better, and Georgian Osten troops. So some fairly motivated, rather nasty German troops. So the fighting got escalated pretty quickly to being pretty grim. And there were these two medics, Robert Wright from Columbus, Ohio, and Kenneth J. Moore from Sonoma County, California, who stumbled across this church in the middle of the night, recognized it as being a large stone building with lots of wooden benches and an ideal place to start treating the wounded that were already piling up before the sun had even come up. And they pinned a Red Cross flag to the door with a little flag that Bob had in his musette bag, and they identified it as a place of aid. And then they went out actively searching for wounded, and eventually brought between 80 and 90 wounded men from both sides and a civilian into this church, where for 36 hours they carried on with no support, no extra equipment, against all the odds. And the interesting thing is they are just medics, and which means their role is to act really as assistants to surgeons. That's what they're there for. They're not really meant to be doing anything beyond put bandage on, wait for doctor. That's kind of their orders, really. But they're leaping in literally to doing things they shouldn't have been doing because they had to save lives. And they did, and they carried on with aid stations in Holland and Germany and Austria. And I was lucky enough, because I started early in the research project. They were both still alive. I got to know them both quite well, and I knew the mayor of the village, who had some cassettes of the French civilians there he'd interviewed 15 years earlier, which I had to play and stop and play about 20 times over to understand the slang and the French slang and trying to make sense of this bad quality recordings. But there was some amazing stuff there from the French, and I contacted my friends who'd written about it, like Mark Bando, who's the American 101st Airborne historian, and George Koskimaki, who'd written a series of books. He was Maxwell Taylor's radio man, and they had talked about this aid station there in their works decades earlier, but in half a page, barely, because they're trying to talk about a division. And I thought, no, there's something here that I didn't know at the time it would evolve into a book. But like all these research projects, you start with one bit and then a second bit and a third bit, and you realize you've got a huge amount of information. And I self-published the book, and it's been selling steadily ever since. And it's very, very gratifying to realize that you're the first person to sort of bring a story to light. The reason it got its title, Angels of Mercy, it was the insistence of the mayor there, Daniel, because the church is the only church in France that is dedicated to Saints Cosmos and Damien, who, long story short, they were twin brother doctors in biblical times who wandered the Mediterranean, giving medical treatment to anybody who needed it, regardless of their faith, creed, or color. They were captured by the Romans. They refused to recant their Christianity, and they were put to death, and so were their families. And then a couple hundred years later, a now Christian Byzantine emperor called Justinian is dying of an ailment that his surgeons cannot identify or cure. And he went to bed and prayed. And overnight, so the legend says, these two angels descended from the heavens and they treated him and saved him. And he had them sainted. And they are Saints Cosmos and Damien. And the mayor said, well, you know, it's just such an interesting parallel that on D-Day, a church dedicated to two angels who descended from the heavens were visited by two more angels who descended from the heavens, in this case by a T-5 parachute from a C-47, and came there and had this dedication to save lives. Sure. But it's a story of humanity. And the fact they treated the Germans equally, I think, is very important. And, you know, you raised it in talking to you before, this idea that there's lots of aspects of the D-Day that are very, very violent and very trying to defeat an enemy, and the humanity gets lost sometimes. And it can be just with World War II touring, as you know, you end up going to a place and here's another story of death on an unparalleled scale, and here's another story of death, and you have to find some stories that break the flow a bit and give something a bit more optimistic to people. Something to aspire to. I mean, we could aspire to World War II heroism generally, but I think there's something about unarmed medics going out treating people that is non-political. It's non-gung-ho. It speaks to all, I think.
It certainly does, and we'll be right back with Paul and more of the story of Angerville in just a moment. But what have we learned so far? That if we take a big story and we break it down into smaller parts, and if we focus on the humanity of the story, people can connect with the history much better. Now let's just take a short break to hear the story of a Good Samaritan named Frank Sisson. This took place in Berlin at the end of World War II. Here's Stories and Stuff with Reg Jans.
Berlin, December 1945. Frank Sisson was promoted as a line sergeant and sent to Berlin. As a member of the military police, he had to keep an eye on the Soviet troops. That winter was really harsh. The people from Berlin were starving. The children were walking through the streets. Their stomachs were swollen, looking for food. But Frank said, that Christmas Day, the cooks had prepared us a fantastic meal. The table was full of the best food you could find, and the smell was incredible. We were all getting ready for our Christmas meal. We sat down at the table, but suddenly I noticed the faces of these children peeking through the window of our headquarters. They were drafted by the aromas of the delicious food. It really spoiled his appetite. Frank left the table, went into the kitchen, and he asked the cooks if they had any hamburgers left, and to tell them when they were ready. Sometime later, Frank Sisson left the command post with 2 bags of hamburgers. He walked up to the children, he wiped the snow from the curb, he sat down with them, and he started handing out the hamburgers to the children. All he saw were smiling faces, he said. He said, you can eat it here with me, I'll eat a burger with you, you cannot take them home, we'll eat them all together. And everybody was smiling, and it was the best Christmas of his life. Even the man of his unit came by, his captain walked by, stopped and saluted him. December 45. Now in 1995, the Daily Oklahoman, local newspaper from where Frank lived, organized a contest. Everybody could submit a story to the newspaper, and the best story would be published on the front page. Frank, remembering his wartime stories from Berlin, sent his hamburger story to the newspaper. Of course, he won, and his story was published. Now, that same day at his home, Frank received a phone call. And there's a voice on the other side of the line with a very heavy European accent, asking him if he was the guy who wrote that story. And Frank was a little surprised, and he said, yeah, that's me. So the guy explained, he said, listen, I'm from Germany, but I'm here in the United States to visit my friends for the holidays. And this morning at our breakfast table, I read that story to the people. And everybody was crying because it's such a wonderful story. But I'm calling you right now to thank you, sir. Because that story is a story that I heard every year at Christmas, ever since I was a very little boy. Because you know, sir, one of these kids on the curb with you that day was my father. Frank was speechless, and he wanted to ask him more questions, but he was so stunned that he said, okay, thank you, and they both hung up. Frank Sisson, you're an amazing man.
Wow, I got goosebumps the first time I heard that story. It's absolutely incredible. You know, Frank Sisson wasn't looking for any fame. He just felt a duty to help those children. And duty was something that the two medics at Angerville also felt. In the moment, in the middle of the battle, in the middle of the war, they felt a duty to help and care for anybody that needed it. So now let's get back to the story of Angerville and the medics Robert Wright and Kenneth Moore with Paul Woodage. And didn't they stand up to the Germans? I understand that the battle raged through the village several times, right? So were there instances of them actually holding their ground and standing up to Germans wanting to see what was going on in the church?
Well, in fact, they stood up against both sides, the Germans and the Allies. One particular incident overnight on the 6th and the 7th, there's a German officer came up with what Bob described as a life-changing wound. Apparently it's in the groin area, and he was bleeding profusely. And Bob, who stood at 5'5", he was quite a small guy. He sort of braced himself up in the doorway of the church and said, "I will absolutely treat you, but the rule is you take your weapon and leave it in the pile beside the doors," as everybody else had been doing. Americans and Germans, their rule was, these two medics, weapons did not come inside the church. This is a place of healing and sanctuary, and it's not about winning and losing. It's about the dead and the dying. And he refused to take his pistol belt off. And every time he tried to sort of squeeze in the church, Bob raced the doorway and said, not till you take your pistol belt off. And eventually the German relented and took his pistol belt off, and he came in and he was treated. But then later, the next day, when the arrival of the Allies, and it was Colonel Sink and the 506th, who were the unit who actually came in, and for people watching this who are familiar with Band of Brothers, when Band of Brothers, the TV show, was originally conceived, there was going to be an episode where Angerville-la-Plain was actually a part of the story, because it was Dick Winters and Carwood Lipton who were the first two American soldiers in the relieving force through the doors of the church to speak to Bob and Ken. The village is still changing hands. The Germans are fallen back to the other side of the village, and a 101st Airborne artillery officer wanted access to the church tower to use for observation. And Bob squared himself up in the door again and said, "You're not coming in the church until it is cleared of the wounded, because it is now a place of aid. There's a Red Cross on it. The Germans have been respecting the neutrality of it. The Americans have been too. You're not going to spoil it and ruin it but now by coming and using it for artillery." And this was an officer. I don't know what rank he was. I'm kind of guessing he was a captain. And this captain went and promptly reported Corporal Wright, Bob Wright, to Colonel Ballard, the commander of 2nd Battalion, later that day, and said how awful it was that a T5 corporal had prevented an artillery officer from gaining access to the church tower. And Ballard said, "Well, you know, I understand exactly what was going on there. You would have made use of that church, but the medic was completely correct to stick to that principle." And so he stood for medicine and neutrality first, not it wasn't that the authority was either German or American. It was the fact that it was now an aid station. And the fact he could have got into trouble for that, I think, is very revealing of what kind of guy he was, and Ken as well, in that they both had this duty, and they both received a Silver Star, I should add, for their service in the church. And Bob, in turn, received the Legion d'Honneur a few years ago. And Bob, interestingly, had always wanted to be a nurse. And since he was a young kid, he wanted to be a nurse, which was in a reverse sexism way. There weren't male nurses in the 1930s and 40s. Nurses were female. And with World War II, he had an opportunity to join the military and become a medic, and chose that, and actually chose to become a medic, and said, he used to say to me, Paul, he said, "If the war ever got so bad that I had to pick up a weapon, we would be defeated anyway. I was much better suited to doing something else." Now, Ken, who was a trained rifleman, the reason he became a medic is he was, with the rest of the men in the company or the battalion, they were shown a film of combat injuries, a little black and white 16mm film flickering away in some kind of Quonset hut or big old tent. And the guys that didn't throw up or vomit were made medics, and that's how Ken became a medic. Or you two that are still left standing, you're a medic, and that's how Ken became a stretcher bearer and then became a medic. So one aspired to be in that role, and the other found himself in it by complete accident.
Incredible.
I think that's so fascinating.
Paul, if there's one message from this whole story that you would want people to get from it, is there a main thing that you would want them to bring out of that?
I think what I aim to achieve with people there is they can picture themselves in that environment easier than they can picture themselves as part of a mass amphibious landing. But inside a church, and you can see the wooden pews, and the wooden pews there have blood stains from men who were lying there bleeding on them, and you can show the altar, and you can see the door they went through, and you can see where the flag was. Even someone who has zero real understanding of the military and the size of this operation can understand being a terrified young person who needs the help of others. And what an important message, given that we're in the middle of this awful COVID-19 global virus. So that I think is the thing, is when people are there, they take on board this story from a very small point of view. They can relate to it, and you can see people looking back and forth, and you know that they're actually imagining these figures running back and forth, and they can see in their mind's eye that there are 5 people crammed to a pew, and that these people are a long way from home, and that they're bleeding, and there's Germans mixed in with Americans, and that they don't know the outcome. And I think that's fascinating, because when you're doing a D-Day tour, we all know the outcome. None of your customers join that tour not knowing that we won. And if they don't know that, then well, you've got to start from somewhere. But in that church, those people there had no idea who the winner and losers were going to be. They just set about their task of treating the wounded.
When you can put a face and a human side to the war, people can connect with it. And if you can get people to connect with history on an emotional level, then then we're doing something right, because then it's going to be memorable for them. And what an amazing story. I'm just so happy to have heard all of that. So thank you again so much for being on today.
I'm happy to be here, and it's a chance to go on a platform that is new, and I like the fact that you're not aiming it at a particular demographic. It's about everyone, accessible, and so much of World War II history is politicized, or it's from a viewpoint of trying to sell something, and it's there's so many stories there and so many viewpoints that can be taken into account, and so any opportunity to talk about it, I think is I will take, because I enjoy talking about it, and you've just got to wind me up, and I'm like the Duracell bunny rabbit. Once I start talking, there's no stopping me.
Everybody, you can learn more about Paul and his work, find his book at his website, ddayhistorian.com, and also check out his other website. His filmmaking projects are on World War II TV. That's www.2tv.com. And really look forward to seeing you again, Paul. Thanks so much.
I look forward to being here again. Thank you very much.
Paul Woodage, everyone. Thanks so much, Paul, for coming on the show. You can see more of Paul on the Bunker Boys show in future episodes, and he'll give us more information about Normandy and what took place there on and following D-Day. There you have it, folks, another piece of the puzzle. It's up to you to figure out where this piece fits in the big picture. We hope you enjoyed watching episode 2. We hope you'll join us on the 6th of June for our special D-Day episode. That's airing on the 6th of June at 10:30 Pacific Standard Time, 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then following that will be episode 3 on June 10th, where we'll have Roland Gall of Gall's Legacy Tours. Our regular series guest, Roland, will be talking about the role of Luxembourg in the Second World War. That's it. That's our show. We hope you enjoyed it. America, be smart. I salute you.